Queensland now there's only two forms of leases. It's a term lease and a perpetual lease, and all the other GHPLs and the special leases have all been melded into those two. So traditionally a pastoral lease would have been for a term of 30 years and was generally for grazing and agricultural purposes. Now under the old legislation you had a right to apply, but the minister had to exercise his discretion. So once 80% of the term of the lease had expired, you could apply to renew it. And I think I did my first one in about 1988, which must be just about up for renewal again now. And he had a whole lot of conditions under the Land Act that he had to look at in making his decision, but he had a discretion. But by and large, there was a commercial expectation that these leases would be renewed. And by and large, they were. There was a few here and there for national park purposes and others that weren't renewed. But it was pretty secure, and the banks recognised this, and you could borrow about as much against an old pastoral lease as you could on freehold. So people were pretty happy up until the 90s. He could impose conditions, and of course the uncertainty was that you just had to go through this renewal process every 30 years. Now this is where the leases are vulnerable. This is where they can come in and hive off bits for national parks. It's where grazing leases over state forests and timber reserves, they could end them and not renew them, which is what happened to a lot of people. So it was at that renewal stage that the leases are and remain vulnerable. So what we now have with the rolling leases, it's just 30 years, 30 years, 30 years. So the legislation says if you apply after 80% of your term, the minister must extend the lease, and there's no limit to the number of extensions that you can receive, but he can still impose conditions. So really, before it happened as a matter of course, now it must happen, but I think pastoral leases are still as vulnerable as they've ever been. Because at the end of this time, they can impose stocking rates, they can excise parts for national parks, they can bring in conservation regimes, so nothing's really changed. I wanted to see term leases with something like a commercial option that you have in the real world, where you exercise the option at the end of the term for a new lease on the same conditions. And that takes all this out of it. But they wouldn't listen, they were driven by the bureaucrats, so nothing really has changed. You do get your rolling lease, but in my view it's no more secure than the term lease was before. So the extension of a lease is not a future act, it doesn't impact on native title, you don't need to get involved in the whole native title debate. There is cultural heritage restrictions under the Act, which you're probably aware of. There's no economic opportunity for Indigenous people, and if they do have native title rights determined over your pastoral lease, they're in perpetuity, they're there forever, but your rights only come around every 30 years. The other thing that Mr Cripps did was the pathway to freehold. Previously, a term lease had to be converted to a perpetual lease and then to freehold, and now you can go straight from term lease to freehold under the new provisions. So if you've got a term lease and you make an application to freehold, I haven't seen one knocked back yet. There's the reduced amount to pay. It used to be akin to the market value. Now it's based on 13 point something times the land rent. It's about 20% of what it would have been before. So it's created a real rush on people wanting to convert their term leases to freehold. And that was really what the block was. Even back before native title came along, people wouldn't freehold their leases because the cost was so high. You also have to do a survey, which is a full identification survey for freeholding purposes. So what people have done is they've gone out, put the application in, they've paid the $70,000, $80,000, $90,000, $100,000, they've got a survey done at $30,000 or $40,000, and then they say, now we have to address native title, how do we get one of these ILUAs? And this is where a lot of lawyers are ringing me up and saying, well, how do we go about this? It can't be too hard. Well, it's just about impossible, because the native title holders have spent years and years and years getting their rights, and they're not about to give them up for freehold to happen, because freehold will extinguish native title. There's no if or but about that. It will extinguish it and it will require compensation. There's been a few cases where there's been some land swaps, small pieces of land have been handed over for freehold, but by and large, native title holders will not extinguish their native title to allow freeholding to proceed. So I think that was a bit of a cruel joke to make the opportunity available, but not to be able to see it through. People should have been told that, and there's a lot of people spend a lot of money now to be frustrated. So what happens with your application to conversion? It is a future act, but a future act is an act that impacts on native title. So in 1996, when the WIC decision was made, if you converted your tenure to a higher tenure, so if you went from leasehold to freehold, that is a future act. It impacts on native title and you need the native title consent for that to happen. So prior to that, you could have converted a term lease to freehold, but the only bar was the cost. But now you've got to get around this native title consideration. So that's the first thing. If you change your tenure from lease to freehold, it will impact on native title. It will extinguish native title. You need consent and you need to pay compensation. But the other thing that people need to be aware of with all the encouragement around tree clearing and agriculture as well, if you've got a term lease for grazing purposes and you want to get into more intensive agriculture, that will also impact on native title. So if we look at something like growing sorghum, which is a direct source of feed to your stock, you can do that on a pastoral lease. But if you want to grow cotton or cane, even though the byproduct might be able to be used as fodder for your cattle, it will impact on native title and you'll need to get the consent of the native title parties. So a lot of people are rushing out and thinking we're going to develop our properties, but on a pastoral lease you can see immediately there's blocks on tenure and there's blocks on use. And that's the problem that native title has posed. If you came to me and said, well, I've got a term lease, there isn't any native title over it, where do I go from here? You can lodge a non-claimant application in the federal court. I think it costs small business about $1,200 and corporations about $3,000. The Native Title Tribunal will issue a notice which is put out in the public arena, and any native title parties have to lodge and register a claim within 90 days. If they lodge and fail registration after 90 days, you can proceed with your freeholding. So if there is no freehold on your block and you've got doubts about whether native title exists, there is a pathway to at least checking. If they do emerge and get their claim registered, then that's the end of your non-claimant application. So at least that's one way of getting some certainty around it. Access is a matter of, is part of the consent process. Cultural heritage, again, is covered by the legislation. If you could get the native title parties to consent, there's some opportunity for economic benefit for them in relation to the property. You will have to pay compensation. There is no law around this. It's somewhere between just basic user rights or full market value. And if I was a native title holder and you were wanting me to extinguish my native title over your $30 million property, I'd be asking for $30 million. And I think that's where the law's heading. So you can just see the frustration around this as getting a term lease to freehold has got a lot of obstacles. I have done some excisions and swaps. We have purchased other lands, and you do need to get involved with these land councils. Now, if anyone here's ever tried to get an ILUA, you'll go to the land council, they say, give us 30 grand, we'll set up a meeting in 3 months with the traditional owners. They'll handpick the traditional owners to come to the meeting. Everyone will sit around and have a big talk, no conclusion. Then they'll say, we'll meet you again in 3 months' time, give us another 30 grand. And this goes on. I've spent 10 years on some of these ILUAs trying to get them across the board. Under the federal legislation, there is no compulsion on the native title holders to attend the meeting, and there's no compulsion to arrive at an outcome. So you can just see that this is a quagmire. And with all respect to the lawyers, they have a field day with this stuff. It just goes on and on and on and on. 10 years of landholders' lives just trying to get a simple agreement. So what's the answer to all this? This was the thrust of the paper that I presented to Senior and Cripps way before the changes to the legislation. As the law stands at the moment, you can convert a term lease to a perpetual lease under the Land Act. So all a perpetual lease is your term lease without a finish date. It doesn't upgrade to a better form of tenure. You've got no greater rights and you don't get any greater right to possession. It's just a term lease without an end date. Now the beauty of that is it's the end of the pastoral lease when you're most vulnerable. So if you've got a perpetual lease, it just goes on forever, and it's a creature of statute, and I think it probably only really exists in that form in Queensland. It just goes on forever. So there's no opportunity for the state to come along and impose new conditions. The rental under the current policy will double, which is something you really need to think about. It's a lot to pay, and it'll go up incrementally with your land values. The other change that we made was perpetual leases previously could not be held by corporations, and now they can. And of course, under those Land Act provisions, you can subdivide it. So this is a bit of a legal argument, but we just need to work through it a little bit. A future act is an act under the Native Title Act that creates a higher form of tenure or changes the land use. So even things like aquaculture or feedlots, if you're going to do that on a pastoral lease, potentially that's going to impact on native title. So a perpetual lease is a future act, but under the Native Title Act it's a permissible future act, and that's the difference. Freeholding's not permissible, it actually extinguishes native title, but just converting to a perpetual lease doesn't, it's a permissible future act. And it will not extinguish native title, and the Act's quite clear about that. So the process is that you make an application to convert, the government will come back and say, well, here's your offer. You don't need to do a full survey because it's still just a lease, but you do need to resolve native title. And our position as a government, not my position, but the government will say, we want you to get an Indigenous land use agreement from the native title parties for that to happen. Now that's just a sellout by them. What the law says is they need to issue a notice to the native title parties saying that we are going to grant this perpetual lease to the landholder. You have a right to object. You have a right to have those objections heard, but we can still ultimately make that decision. And if there's any compensation coming out of that, we will pay it. Now, there is no impact on native title in this process, so there's no question of compensation. So what successive governments have done is said, oh, that's all too hard for us, we're just going to make you go and get one of these ILUAs, even though it doesn't extinguish native title, and you don't need the native title party's consent. So you get bogged in this roundabout again. It presents the biggest single opportunity, in my view, in Queensland to secure tenure and to bring some economic opportunity to Indigenous people. Over 55% of Queensland is leasehold, and of those pastoral leases, there's very little opportunity for Aboriginal people to come onto the pastoral lease, to engage in the cultural heritage protection or to get any economic opportunity out of it. So they're getting their rights in perpetuity, but you're still sitting on this 30-year rolling lease, 30-year turnover in terms of your leases. So one of these that I'm doing at the moment, we've sat down, there's the Yuman and the Tagalaka people, and we've struck a deal with them where they're going to allow him to proceed to a perpetual lease without compensation. And rather than looking at royalties where you pay so much for the number of cattle you run or so much for the grain that you grow, he's worked out a land utilisation payment. So he'll pay so much per hectare for whatever the land use is. It might be 5 cents for grazing, $2 for past tree clearing, $5 for future tree clearing, and $10 for irrigation. But it's a fixed amount of money and it's a one-off payment, and that's all he's paying. And we've gone to the government and said, the land rent that you're taking from this land that really belongs to the traditional owners and putting in your coffers, you should give to them as part of their economic basis. And then there's a jobs training program going on. So for very little cost, they're getting benefit out of this. For the first time, these people are getting back onto this property. They grew up there as kids, haven't been back in 40 or 50 years. So there's a real opportunity for a proper agreement outside the process. So he'll end up with a perpetual lease. He'll end up with being able to irrigate on what was previously a pastoral lease. The Indigenous people will have an opportunity to work. If they don't work, they don't get paid. There's a one-up payment in lieu of compensation for what he's doing on the land, and it's a real win-win for everybody involved. I would like to see that spread out regionally right across Queensland. And it flows into a little bit into this whole tree clearing debate. He's got 150,000 acres of permits, and he's got dozers running like mad at the moment trying to get the trees down before the government stops him. 3 weeks ago on Friday, they issued a notice on him to stop clearing immediately because he cleared a watercourse that didn't exist. It was just a flat paddock, but they thought there was a river through the middle of it and he'd cleared it. So they put a stop work notice on him at 5 o'clock on Friday. He had 4 teams of bulldozers spending about $40,000 a week in fuel, all under contract. So you can see where that was headed. We tried on the Monday to negotiate to get them going again. They wouldn't listen. By Tuesday lunchtime, we had him in court and he was rolling the dozers again at 2 o'clock, and they still are. So, Peter, you've got to fight them. You can't allow bureaucrats to roll over the top. So the beauty for him is that he wants to work with the Aboriginal people within the process to get the best possible outcomes. So if we can look on a regional basis, he's clearing less than 10% of the total land area, but if we look at the entire catchment, it's probably only about 0.5%. So if we can get a regional agreement around the Gulf in terms of native title so that all the pastoral leases can be upgraded to perpetual leases, if there is proper Indigenous employment and not this token stuff that's going on at the moment, and then we can get water rights, I've been talking to Tom about this, and tree clearing rights on a regional basis, and I hope Lachlan's listening. This is the way forward for the government, and I think this is where Property Rights Australia can really get together and push this through so it's a policy. So people aren't being singled out. You've got a regional tree clearing policy, and if you're in that area, you can manage your vegetation according to that policy, and the same with water. You're not going in there as single landholders all the time being picked off. Now this guy I'm acting for, he's got deep pockets and he's happy for a fight, but that's impossible. You know, look at Sharon and Rob Lose, the struggle they've had for 10 years, and they're going to lose their property through this whole, I think what they did was actually they had a grazing lease over a state forest, and they've just said, well, at the end of the term, that's it, you're off. We don't care how long you've lived here. So this is pretty technical legal argument, but I think the point is, as a group, you need to lobby to get your term leases turned into perpetual leases. Everybody else's rights are in perpetuity, and why shouldn't yours be as well?